A while ago, I streamed my first playthrough of Persona 3. Since I take, forever to make new game review videos, I thought I'd try something new. This video is a rough first impressions kind of video, mainly for my regular stream viewers. I want to quickly get out my thoughts on my first playthrough, but still have it be scripted so it's more organized and thought out than I could do live. I haven't done much research on Persona 3, and I'm like 99% blind on the rest of the franchise. I haven't even played many JRPGs, but I am a genius, and I have an internet connection, so here are my thoughts. Also spoilers, obviously. Also, I played FES, so that's what I'll be talking about. Persona 3 is a classic-style JRPG. 4 niggas in a row, use the right attack type for massive damage, keep a cute girl in your party to heal, and gain XP with little control over stat growth. Along with that JRPG gameplay, P3 includes basically a whole other game that's some mix of stick RPG and a visual novel. Traditionally, Japanese role-playing games take place in, kind of ironically, a European fantasy setting. One exception is the Mother games, which take place in, like, rural-ish America. I think the unusual setting and tone of those games is the main reason people like Mother 1 and 2, even though the gameplay is really boring. Persona 3 is another exception, being set in modern Japan. I assume it's the same for the previous SMT games, but nobody really knows. This other game of Persona 3 has the player make choices in how the player character will spend his days, separated by differing sections of the day, like morning, lunchtime, evening. This part depicts the mundane, normal parts of the characters' lives, what they're doing when they're not partying up and fighting monsters. It's about the experience of a modern-day Japanese high school student, because that's what the main character is. Chat with your friends on the way to school, listen to your extremely nationalistic teacher, go watch a movie with your bro, play at the arcade, and get home just in time to grab your gun and blow your brains out. I think that's basically Persona 3 summarized. Do normal high school kid stuff during the day, go to Tartarus and do JRPG fights at night. The daily life part spaces out the combat, but it isn't just a totally segregated telling of the story. During these parts, you gain stats that, in a roundabout but still real way, affect your performance in combat. Not going to get into the details, but you talk to important NPCs, make the right choices at the right times, and build up your social links with them. That's the name of the mechanic. As you deepen your relationship with the characters, your social link with them will increase in rank. Each social link is represented by an arcana, tarot cards. In Persona 3, you fight by summoning a devil, a demon, a monster, sometimes an angel, a cryptid, whatever, called a persona. Personae are Pokemon for mythology nerds. Each persona is also categorized under a specific arcana. When you create a new persona, they'll immediately gain experience and levels based on your rank in the corresponding social link. Basically, the better you're doing at interacting with the important characters, the stronger any new dudes you make are going to be. I have some things to say about the specifics of this system, but for now, that's the gist. You need to do the combat to make progress and beat the game, so you're rewarded for all the normal life stuff you do during the day with more power. This is the main reason I enjoyed Persona 3. This format of game is really cool to me. I've said many times on stream before that my favorite Zelda game is Majora's Mask. I like the juxtaposition of the more common heroic save-the-world premise, but alongside a depiction of a more mundane world where you get to know a lot of side characters and do things for them. Majora's Mask handles things quite differently in that the gameplay is more uniform, and that core gameplay is woven into the NPC interactions. In P3, like I've shown, daily life is menu navigation and visual novel style dialogue. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Having the two segregated types of gameplay is just a different way of doing things, and puts the focus more on having them space each other out. Throughout my playthrough, I expressed some exasperation at having to go through the combat parts while praising the daily life parts. It seems like a good chunk of P3 fans feel the same way. There is something to that, which I'll get into later, but Really, I also said several times while streaming that the combat was pretty satisfying. After spending some time thinking about the game and looking back on my own gameplay videos, I think there's a lot good to say about P3's combat. There aren't really any twists to the traditional JRPG style of combat with P3, but there are extra systems layered on top of it. I've never been a fan of classic JRPG gameplay, but not because there's anything wrong with it, just because almost every single game I've played is way too simple and gets boring fast. So, P3 having more stuff to add depth is a good thing. The most prominent difference is the huge focus on damage types. Attacks having different damage types and characters having different resistances is nothing new. But it's way more common in P3 than any JRPG I've played other than Pokemon. It's arguably even more relevant than in those games because of how huge the effects of hitting an enemy with damage they're weak to are. If you hit an enemy with their weakness, they'll take more damage than a neutral attack, as expected, but they'll also get knocked down, and you get one more action for your turn.
One more.
Enemies who are knocked down have to use a turn to get up. Additionally, if all enemies are knocked down at once, your team can do an all-out attack, a powerful attack that hits all enemies.
I've been waiting for this.
So with the above mechanics in mind, a straightforward ideal fight in P3 would be like this. You're fighting, let's say, 4 enemies who are weak to fire. You hit one with a fire attack. That enemy takes a lot of damage, gets knocked down, and you now have one more action. So, you hit a different enemy with your fire attack. They get knocked down, you have one more. So on and so on until all 4 enemies have taken a strong hit and are knocked down. Then your team does an all-out attack. That will often be enough to kill the enemies right then and there, all in the first turn. And keep in mind, when I say the first turn, I just mean the player character's turn. Your ally persona users still have their turns after you do all that with yours. If you don't take advantage of enemy weaknesses, the fight looks incredibly different. Even if you're fighting weak enemies and you can kill each guy in only 2 neutral hits, the most you can kill in your first turn is 2 of them. The other 2 still get 2 hits in on your party before the fight is over, and that's a lot more than 0. Realistically, it would be even worse than that, because everything I've been describing applies the other way around. The good guys have weaknesses too, and enemies using that type will deal extra damage, knock you down, and get one more action. I don't want to explain every little thing about this game's mechanics. This is supposed to be a quick video primarily meant for people already familiar with the game, but I wanted to lay all that out to emphasize just how insanely strong super effective attacks are. If you take advantage of enemy weaknesses, things are insanely different from if you fail to take advantage of them. This probably sounds like you just do nothing but pick the right attack types, whatever the enemies are weak to, and then all-out attack. Not all that thrilling. P3 gets a bit more complicated than that for a few reasons. Sometimes you won't have an attack type enemies are weak to. From the mid-game on, that can make you think more about team building. By that I mean both what personae you bring and what persona users you bring. When I fought this thing made of electricity, it was nice to have Akihiko with me who resists electricity. Aigis is weak to it, but I didn't care.
When you fall, get right back up.
That's right, Aigis. Another thing is that if you want to be as methodical as you can, it can be beneficial to not use all-out attacks. If you don't do all-out attacks, you can just keep this boss stun-locked forever. Here's someone else's footage because I didn't do it in my playthrough. You can do this with a lot of fights, because enemies have to spend a turn getting up after being knocked down. That probably doesn't sound great either, but it's not something you can do all the time because some bosses have no weaknesses, and also it uses a lot of SP. All-out attacks are physical, so it's a lot of damage that's free both in terms of turn usage and SP cost. Really, that applies to using super effective damage in general, regardless of the decision to follow it up with an all-out. Sometimes you do just want to use a physical attack in the first place to conserve SP. So yeah, combat can be kind of complicated sometimes, and that's great. So why is there this attitude about the gameplay being a big issue and getting in the way of the high school girl dating simulator? I'll start out with an issue that probably nobody else has and will make everyone think I'm crazy. P3's Persona unlock progression is a lot more linear than I expected, and I don't love it. Generally, you get new personae by fusing previous ones together. Two weaker, lower-tier ones will make a more powerful one. This, in itself, isn't bad, but what I don't like is how this is pretty much always the correct thing to do. Personae from earlier in the game have limits on what moves and how many moves they can learn. Additionally, a newer persona you fuse will be higher level at base, and probably even higher because you've had more time to rank up your social links. So your new guys will get more of an XP bonus when you first fuse them. I really liked using Apsaras early in my playthrough because Cadenza was such a powerful and fun move to use. She's also cute. I spent a good chunk of the playthrough with Apsaras and Orpheus in my team, not realizing at first that she has a limit to new moves she could learn. I seriously thought I could keep her in my party indefinitely and end up with her at a high level and really powerful by the end game. I really feel like that should be viable. I don't want to sound like I'm demanding every JRPG be like Pokemon, a series that I also have a ton of criticisms for, but man does it BTFO Persona 3's team building, at least to my taste. People often compare these two games not just for the similarity of the game's typing systems, but the framing of collecting your party members. On the face of it, P3's Persona collecting seems like a quote-unquote mature version of catching Pokemon. When it comes to gameplay though, there's a lot more room for critical thinking for building an effective team, while also giving more freedom of expression in Pokemon. To team build properly in Persona 3, you just keep using personae as you progress through the game. You level up, and oh, some new ones are available. Time to fuse. Goodbye, old persona who's weak and gay. Hello, new one who has higher stats and better moves and better type resistances. There's not a lot of thinking to be done, you want the newest devils to summon because they're stronger. Maybe your persona husband is Dionysus. You can have a late game team with him along with Apsaras, Orpheus, and Inugami, but then you're doing a challenge run, not making a choice with a set of interesting pros and cons. When you're playing for the first time and you're trying to perform well, the design of the fusion system encourages linear progression, meaning most players are going to have similar teams at similar points in their playthroughs. At least that's how it feels to me. Maybe there's something I'm missing here. I'd be happy to find out there is. I want to clarify that I know I'm asking for a lot here. It's weird to criticize a game because you wish a system worked entirely differently, in a way that would also need various other aspects of the game to be rebalanced. But I'm new to the series, and this is supposed to be my thoughts and feelings, and my feelings are more important than reason or reality. To the game's credit, there are the super secret Persona fusions that I never got, as well as the whole fusing weapons thing that I don't remember how it works at this point. Persona fusion and progression clearly has effort put into it, I just think the fundamental direction of it could be better. Speaking of me being a weirdo, here's something even most Persona 3 fans hate that didn't bother me much. No control of your party members. I see why it's bad game design, I get it, but it generally didn't cause problems for me. I set my guys to their appropriate tactics, and they behaved reasonably well 95% of the time. Wow, he's healing me even though he's got 8 HP left. I mean, again, main character dies, everyone loses, so good choice. Hot take. There's some appeal to it. When you have a game like Persona 3, where a big part of the appeal is the characters, it's kind of cool for those characters to have autonomy in combat. When they do something cool, it feels a bit more like they're the ones doing that cool thing instead of just you. Good job, Junpei. This is actually really good, because he keeps wasting turns lowering our defense just for Junpei to raise it back up. He's my defense up slave, yeah. I have been told that future Persona games give the player direct control over all the party members, and I have to admit I feel a little bit disappointed. Still, I agree it's for the best. For this idea of NPC autonomy to really reach its potential, you'd want a more complicated system designed specifically for that. Like, maybe a certain character could be more likely to choose aggressive moves over debuffs, or status curing versus health recovering, even within the constraints of their tactics. Or maybe different characters have a different percentage chance to ignore the tactics you set them to, in a way that corresponds to their personality or their trust of the player character in the story. Ideally, this could be woven into the social link system. Max out Empress and you can command Mitsuru to cast Mind Charge yourself. There doesn't seem to be any character differences like that in P3 systems, so any sense of them being more unique is just a matter of their move pool. Think about it like this. When you set a party member to use certain tactics, you are technically choosing moves for them anyway, just within a more broad set of possibilities than direct control. Would I try to play P3 without ever setting tactics? No. That alone is an admission that direct control is preferable. Any characterization of your party members through gameplay can still take place just from their skill pool, stats, and what equipment they can use, which Persona 3 and presumably the other games already do. If you want a guy who's a hothead who just wants to kill, then design him to only have attacking moves. This is part of the reason I dislike how common healing moves become in P3 toward the late game. Another problem is having to analyze enemy traits the first time you encounter them is annoying and pointless. There's no real choice to it, you want to know about the enemy, so you analyze them. Having the first turn be blind is theoretically interesting, so you can experiment and find out about the enemy yourself. The downside to that is that having the player be blind introduces an element of luck. I'm guessing that's why the one kind of enemy Fuka can identify is bosses, since they have a checkpoint right before them. Maybe making analysis take a turn is an attempt to compromise between experimenting and giving players info they should have. I think it's pointless though, because the analysis finishes too fast for you to experiment. If it just happened automatically as soon as the fight started, Fuka would still have a place in the party thematically, and it would be less annoying. Once the game starts introducing enemies that are palette swaps of earlier enemies, but with different resistances, analyzing them gets really tedious and the pointlessness feels more obvious than ever. But really, that applies to the whole combat system. Yes, P3's combat that I was just praising starts to get old from about the midpoint of the game on. Some fights remain interesting and fun throughout, especially the full moon events. But finding new enemies that, actually you've seen before, analyzing them, hitting them super effectively, cleaning them up, etc., just the whole process starts to get old before long. In my stream chat, some people attributed this to the fundamental nature of Tartarus, the game's main dungeon. I don't have a huge problem with Tartarus itself. A giant dungeon that's a bunch of procedurally generated hallways with superficial changes in terrain and the same out-of-battle mechanics throughout is repetitive. I don't mind repetition in games though, if the gameplay is deep enough. I find the idea of a dungeon that's designed to be an efficient combat delivery system to be kind of neat. It's a very utilitarian kind of design that I like in a lot of games. Thematically it's cool because it's a big tower, and big towers are cool. Throughout the game you wonder just how many floors it has until the top. The characters even mention this at one point, if memory serves me right. I remember when I was streaming, a viewer who's familiar with P3 threw out a number like 150 something, and I thought it was a joke. There's no way it goes on for that long, I thought. Turns out he was joking. Just not in the way I expected. It goes on for much longer. 264 floors. During this massive journey, the combat that I praised earlier started to wear on me. Fights with regular enemies are largely trivialized by super effective hits and the one more system. The SP cost of using skills on common enemies isn't very relevant when you can just go back to the entrance anytime. Sure, it sets you back to the last checkpoint, but it's not that hard to make a mad dash to Tartarus's checkpoints. Then you just go back and use the enemies on previous floors to get EXP and money and stuff to be strong enough to take on the boss. You do this for 500 floors. Like 264 floors. I'm going to say it. It's grindy. With the samey feeling of the combat against regular enemies, progressing through Tartarus starts to be a slog well before the end. That said though, I don't think Tartarus itself is the issue, at least not on its own. Looking at my playthrough towards the end game, I can see that in how a lot of the time I spent outside of Tartarus also started to feel tedious. After I'd maxed my academic stat, plus a few other things, I felt like I had nothing to do during a lot of sections of the day. Maybe I'd feel differently if I'd gone for a more completionist playthrough, but Who's going to do that on their first time if they're not using a guide or something? Then again, if I were playing more optimally, I'd have finished various content faster, which would leave me with the same problem of feeling like I had nothing to do. If I wasn't fighting a boss or progressing the story somehow, I often felt like I was just trying to get through the days until the end. Persona 3 does have a lot of content, and I'm not asking for there to be more. I think the solution would be cutting things down and rebalancing things to fit that. What doesn't help is that even the story stuff that many people praise, myself included, sometimes feels like filler. Mamoru and Kazushi's storylines are way too similar, even though I like both of them. Even Chihiro and Fuka have too much in common. I know that statement will piss certain people off. Nozomi's story was a big anti-climax that made me regret spending my time maxing that social link. All the stuff with the main cast was awesome, but it spread out way too much. It's very front and end loaded. You barely get to play the game at first, being bombarded with cutscenes, but then it takes forever for there to be any development with Yukari, Junpei, or Mitsuru. It's weird because there is no social link for the male members of the main cast. Like, replace Nozomi's story with something involving Akihiko, come on. Tell me a story about how his real aspiration in life is cooking French cuisine. I know the guys have social links in Portable. Persona 3 as a whole goes on for too long. The pacing is the issue. Maybe that's inevitable because of the way the game is structured with its hard time limits, not just with full moon events and other major story points, but the final, ultimate, super final time limit. There does need to be some leeway so players won't have to play totally optimally to be prepared for events to come. At this point, having only played through the game once and wanting to move on to what else the series has to offer, I can't quite work out a solution. But my feelings as of right now are, I hate 1,000-hour JRPGs! Still, I had a good time with Persona 3. For all the nitpicks I had with the combat, and the problems that the limited time system seems to cause with the game's pacing, they played their role in the overall experience. That experience is unique, and something I liked, and I want more of it. Good thing there are 4 other Persona games. While it is true that the regular enemies throughout Tartarus get pretty mindless, the game's bosses are all great. They show that P3's combat system is pretty good. I especially love the Full Moon bosses. Persona 3 and Chrono Trigger both have awakened me to the fact that gimmicky bosses are a really good fit for JRPGs. Even regular battles in Tartarus aren't that bad since you have plenty of things to keep in mind outside of just winning a particular battle. You can find loot, get enemy drops for Elizabeth missions, initiate fights with sneak attacks, prioritize fighting red shadows for a ton of EXP, split up your party, all along with basic resource management that's at least as good as any other JRPG. None of this is really that deep, but it was just enough to keep me thinking about what I was doing when I was going through Tartarus, which is more than I can say for most JRPGs I've played. The calendar system is a huge reason why P3 is so cool to me. It does a lot to immerse you in its world. For as grindy as Tartarus can seem, I think its pacing of boss fights in relation to full moon events is great. Remember, after beating the current boss of Tartarus, you'll encounter a barrier blocking your progress that'll go away once you've gotten past the next full moon. The current Tartarus boss is always harder than the current full moon boss, so it's a good signal to the player that they're well prepared and they don't need to grind. The tired mechanic also does a decent job at disincentivizing grinding too.
I'm not tired. Ken-kun seems tired.
Here's something I didn't think about while playing P3, but I definitely felt it. The regular occurrence of full moons and the time you spend at Tartarus beforehand is kind of like studying for school. That's what the game setting and story are all about. Actually, remember, I was totally blind my first playthrough and didn't even know there were hard time limits in P3 at first. I didn't use my time well, ended up falling really behind, and had to restart the playthrough. It's kind of poetic that that was the playthrough where I literally didn't study. What will you do? Sleep early? You think I'm gonna study? Funny. On my second playthrough, I really put my grindstone to the nose, or whatever the phrase is, used every section of every day, stayed at Tartarus until people were tired, and did some minimal thinking about how I would spend my days in advance. Sure enough, the full moons were all pretty easy. Just like exams, you know the full moon events are coming up, so it's up to you to use your time well until then, so you can easily curb stomp this nerd. Another grenade? Thanks. It's nice to see thematic relevance through the game's structure like that. At this point, I guess I'm talking about Persona 3's story. Don't worry, I don't have as much to say about it. The supernatural events of Persona 3's story aren't all that interesting to me. I don't really know how the Dark Hour works, or what the Fall is, or what it means that everyone turns into coffins. By the way, reminder that that's what happens. During the Dark Hour, regular people aren't trapped inside coffins, they specifically turn into coffins. Anyway, even some stuff that is blatantly explained I've forgotten, and never cared that much about to begin with. I don't care.
Really? If you say so.
I do. Like, what exactly Ryoji is, or what Strega's goals were. I forgot.
Such foolishness is what I am trying to rid this world of.
Oh right, that's it. He's trying to rid the world of foolishness. I'm guessing some things are supposed to be mysterious. I'm fine with that, since at least it gives me a feeling of the group of teenagers you play as being out of their depth. Even with a few of them having actual connections to what's going on, they only know small details. And that's what's important to me about Persona 3's setting, the big picture. I like the general vibe that the supernatural elements give of being bigger than society could comprehend. I don't know anything about tarot cards in real life, but P3's universe being centered around it gives a sense of very primal forces at work. The personae you summon do the same. Almost all of them are figures from various myths from different cultures. All of these mythologies and religions are true in P3's world, at least to some extent. That means this teenage boy is summoning and commanding beings who've been around since before humanity. Angels and devils, forces of nature. Sexuality is a big part of Persona 3. I could stop there, that's already a reason to be happy. I think it's really good in P3 though because it's not just about the girls you can date. Actually, it barely applies to the romantic social links at all. No, the more risque content has to do with the personae themselves. Most of these personae were invented by primitive societies to whom sex necessarily had a lot of significance and reverence. Things like Lamia, Succubus, Dionysus, and Virtue, their physical beauty and sexuality are on display. On some Persona descriptions it'll go into a little detail there, including a blatant mention of incest. That's history for you. It all strengthens a feeling of ancientness in the magic that the main cast is dealing with. I have some more things to say about sexuality in Persona 3 for sure, but for now I want to wait until I play more of the games. I think there's a lot going on that's pretty clever. Finally, Gekkoukan and the surrounding city are great. Persona 3 is one of those works that make you want to go full weeaboo and live in Japan. I know it's idealized. I'm not about to move there. America is pretty great. I know that in Persona 3 Portable you can't move around the school and town like this. A lot of people like that version, good for them, but that's a huge downside for me. P3 is actually the first classic-style JRPG I've played with this kind of 3D overworld, and obviously it works really well with the daily life aspect. As for the story as it pertains to the characters, that's the main draw for a lot of people, and really the most important thing. What's most fun to me is how social link stories are totally unrelated to the ongoing Dark Hour. Yukari and Mitsuru are more connected to the main plot than almost anyone else. Meanwhile, Mitsuru's social link is about her struggling to balance her perceived duty to her father's company and her personal desires. Yukari's social link is about her feelings toward her estranged mother and her difficulty in forming deep connections with people despite being popular and outgoing. Sometimes it doesn't work out, like the Moon and Fortune stories being really boring in my opinion, but then you have Akinari, who is diagnosed with a terminal illness. All you do is sit on a bench and talk to him a few times, but it's a really well done story. Even if it didn't connect to the main story's themes of death, it would be good, but it does. The story is hit or miss, but when it hits, damn. I expect very little in the way of philosophy from anime game stories, but Persona 3's messages about death and living life to its fullest are done really well. I couldn't even say exactly what that message is, because the subject is handled through different characters in a way that's different and appropriate for each one. All the fluff stuff really is more than just fluff and has value because of this theme, like the trip to Kyoto or the movie marathon. It helps to build up your liking of the characters, giving it a lot more impact when things get serious, and also feeding into the theme of living a full life. Neither the individual stories or the overall story are the deepest I've ever read or anything, but they're exactly as deep as they should be for their role in Persona 3. Persona 3 is a game, a JRPG, and the overall package is what matters, so while characters like Yukari having some depth is awesome, the characters have to be appealing on a surface level. Like, your JRPG team has to be fun, and P3 nails that. You don't need a 2-hour character analysis video to see the appeal of fighting alongside these goofballs. Like, you get to fight with the human embodiment of Shadow the Hedgehog, the cutest robot girl in all of fiction, and a dog. Not a magical talking dog or anything, just a regular dog who's a really good boy. I don't care if that makes me sound like a Redditor. I also don't care how it sounds that possibly my biggest reason for liking P3 is just that I like Aigis a lot. That's just the game doing its job. Anything else? No, this is too long already. Persona 3 has some flaws. The main issue is pacing, which is a big enough problem to make me think twice before recommending the game to someone, even if they're a weeaboo JRPG fan. But the high points of Persona 3 were great. I've gotten more hype during P3's gameplay than any other single-player JRPG by far. Okay, no fire, no electricity. Ice? Haha! The combat system leaves every other one but Pokemon's in the dust. I loved the main cast of characters, including the one even P3 fans in my chat seem to hate. Most importantly, P3 shows the real strength of the genre. This kind of combat is really well suited for reflecting character progression that's happening in the story. The daily life system helps tie everything together even better, giving weight to your actions in the game, and also framing things narratively as enjoying the small things in life while you have the chance. Is that what Persona 3's story is all about? I'm not sure, but Persona 3 is a small thing that you can enjoy, if you're me. That's all. Let me know what you all thought of my video, especially all y'all who are normally in my streams. Normally I'd spend a lot more time on my scripts, which would ironically make the video shorter. JRPGs aren't normally my thing anyway, so for all the flaws I've talked about, it's saying a lot that I'm excited to play Persona 4 next. This is me. You've been listening to the voice of Aigis from Persona 3 throughout this video. Goodbye. Okay, me and Aigis are taking him out this turn. Do it. There we go. My girl. She decided she wanted to live. Woo, that was awful.